Hello again everyone and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John and as always, thank you so much for being here. A good topic, let's do it. What's the most disturbing thing you've ever seen in real life? Serious. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Seeing my dad cry about the fact he knew he was going to die from a very rare form of lymphoma, he very rarely cried. It was like 12 days after his cancer diagnosis where he died. A couple days before we were all crying because we learned his cancer was terminal. He just sat there not crying too. I just think he was ready. He seemed at peace, even casually mentioning how he thought it was going to his brain because of things. Also, him basically going crazy before they intubated him. He had trouble breathing due to a large tumor on his lungs. I just hope he's doing alright up there. I miss him. He would have been 59 on the 7th of this month. Worked with a very young guy who was in recovery from heroin abuse. One day he relapsed and still came to work. He was in no shape to work, but I didn't want to send him out on his own for the day. I also didn't want to report it because it possibly send him back to jail or get him removed from his halfway house. I told him to lay down on a couch in the office until he came down. I gave him some bottles of water and left food on the table. I checked on him about 30 minutes later, and he was face down with a pool of blood under his jaw. He was alive, but he had chewed a hole in his tongue and lip. Called an ambulance. They said he was lucky he fell off the couch, or he would have probably choked on his own blood. He recovered after a few weeks, but lost a chunk of his tongue in the process. He improved over the next year and remained sober. He started dating a girl and they got married after a few months. I got a phone call about a year later informing me that he had relapsed again and died of an overdose. He found out his wife was pregnant and couldn't deal with it. He was a good kid, but if he wasn't constantly monitored, he would make some pretty poor decisions. Seeing my dad on his deathbed on Thanksgiving morning and sitting with him while he passed, I was 16. I remember thinking it didn't look like him because of all the tubes and meds he had in his system. It was freaky seeing him like that at first. Driving in the rain home, I saw a car skid by herself. She was driving fast. She ended up wrapping around a tree completely. She was alone in the car. She was easily 18 or younger, worked at the Taco Bell by my house. I drove up onto the sidewalk fast and ran across the street. The poor girl. She was so scared she was trembling. The tree completely fell. The car ended up crushing in on her legs. They put a tarp over her legs while they were trying to get her out. My mom told me to leave by then. I hope she's okay. My dad telling my sister, she was like 16 and I was like 18 at the time, that her best friend committed suicide. I never heard my sister scream so much, and I saw my dad cry for the first time in my life. My mother dropped dead of a massive heart attack in front of my 10-year-old son. He yelled for me to come, and I found her face first on the floor. I sent my son to his bedroom and called 911. They instructed me to flip her over and perform CPR. Blood gurgled from her mouth and her nose was bent to the side. She didn't even have time to put her arms out to catch herself. I'm so sorry I couldn't save her. When I was in my early 20s, I worked at a warehouse on the dock. One day a truck driver called to me from one of the bay doors. He had left his keys and newspaper on the dock. I went to retrieve the items and turned around to face him, and realized that a trailer was backing into the same bay door, pinning this man between the dock and the trailer. Me and this guys got the trailer to back off, and the man collapsed on the ground. I found out the next day he succumbed to his injuries. I blamed myself for years and nearly drank myself to death. Part of my job as a NICU nurse is caring for babies who are withdrawing from opiates. The level of suffering they go through is utterly gut-wrenching. They have this constant high-pitched cry that is honestly more of a shriek. Their little bodies overheat because they can't sleep or lay still and are so tense that you can barely bend their arms. They're jittery and sweaty and will claw at their skin in desperation and wind up covered in scratches and skin tears from thrashing about. They have constant diarrhea, and their poor little butts break down because of them even more pain. They can't even eat because they're so frantic from the withdrawal that they can't coordinate suck, swallow, breathe. My heart breaks for these little babies, and it's so hard to not be judgmental and angry with the mothers. It's even more sad that the majority of these babies aren't going to have a great life after they get older either. All of these stories today are relatively completely heartbreaking, and this one's no exception. Babies are innocent. It's just, that sucks. Watching my father take his last breath in hospice care. It's nothing uncommon, sure, but it's the first time I've ever seen someone die. The look on his face still haunts me. Edit. Thank you, everyone who offered support and shared their own stories and feelings about loved ones passing. You're all amazing and wonderful people, and I know we're all feeling the same kind of pain. It hurts, but we'll get through it somehow. When I was really young, we were crossing a massive bridge. I remember the sudden traffic and my family talking about what it could be about. We finally got to the point on the bridge where we saw what's happening. I'll never ever forget the way the sunbeams went through the clouds, just like a movie. A woman in big black sunglasses, blonde hair, smiling, and on the other side of the bridge. My grandfather said it was an angel, and I truly believed that for a long time. It wasn't until I was showering, when I was way older, and randomly thought of that time and realized she was going to jump. It's disturbing how happy she was, but probably in so much pain. I remember her stretching her arms out while holding the railing to really extend herself over the edge. She was ready for it. Posted elsewhere, but I work in a service shop for cars. We had our security system team out to rewire cameras and sensors for the auto garage doors you pull up to. While he was up there wiring whatever it was, the power was still on to the door he was working on, and the sensor triggered from something passing through. He was caught in between the rolling garage door and the metal bar it was attached to. Full speed. The door didn't even register that he was in there. The longest 20 minutes of my life was watching the entire shop try to use every possible tool, floor jack, scissor jack, ladders, bare hands, all while you could only see him from the waist down. He made it, fortunately. The fire department said if we didn't have a scissor jack, he was gone. 3 jaws of life to pry him from that door. When I was a senior in high school, I still walked to school because it was only a mile away and I didn't want to pay for gas. My great-grandmother's house was way to school. One morning I was running late to school and I saw trucks and ambulances. I dropped my coffee cup and sprinted down the block to turn the corner and see my great-grandmother curled in a ball on the icy pavement dead. She had wandered outside to let her dog out and had fallen and frozen to death. Her little dog used my dead grandmother's body heat to not freeze to death. I was the only one that saw my grandmother's frost-bitten hands and face, her hands frozen into cruel claws and her glasses laying in the snow next to her. To this day, I'm still the only one that saw what she looked like. I graduated 2 weeks later. Getting a phone call at work from my 12-year-old daughter that their mother, my ex-wife, fell down and wasn't breathing. We went through a difficult divorce largely due to her alcohol and drug abuse. I had custody of my daughters, and for about 2 years she didn't have any visitation. However, she was recently awarded limited visitation by the court, and she overdosed and died in front of our 9 and 12-year-old daughters within a few weeks of regaining visitation. Cancer. A roommate of mine got cancer, and you could smell the stench of death all the way to the porch at the entrance of the house we were renting. He'd already had it when I moved in, and the rent was cheap enough to not raise a stink about it, intended. A bag of bones and bags of shit were all he had been reduced to. Drank himself to death and absolutely ruined his pancreas over a divorce. One of the things that stood out to me was on Fridays he liked to get all dressed up and put these red croc-skinned boots on, but he wouldn't get up from the bed or anything because he didn't have the strength. He'd just lie there with his boots on, a cowboy to the end. If not for that man, I wouldn't be where I'm at today, literally. He loaned me some cash so that I could drive to Portland from my hometown across the country. That was the last time I saw him. I gave him a hug because I knew it would be the last time. Rest easy, no. 4 years ago on New Year's Eve, my husband and I were driving back home at around 6 p.m., so a little light was left in the sky. We were on the freeway, and all of a sudden I could see a body flying through the air. It was perfectly straight and just kind of doing flips like when you throw a pencil or something. My husband stopped the car and I ran like 30 feet to the body. Turns out he had hopped the divider and ran in front of the lady's car directly in front of us. He 100% died on impact, and I had never been close to a dead body before. Some ladies started trying to give him CPR, and if you've seen CPR in real life, then you know how awful it looks. His abdomen was distended, and his tongue was sticking out. It was literally shit out of a horror movie. Apparently the guy was drunk and running from a cop and just was too gone to know what he was doing. I can still see the silhouette flying through the air every time I get in the car. It was horrible. My brain-dead brother. The morning of, I had a 4-hour nightmare of laying in bed as the terrible pain in my mind slowly slipped away. I was terrified. When I woke, I knew something was wrong. I was told hours later my brother was brain dead after a heart attack caused by a cerebral hematoma. I sped home. When I got there, I saw him. His eyes were half open, slack-jawed, with exposed brain matter. They had opted for surgery on the incredible unlikely possibility it could help. I nearly fainted. However, the worst bit came after. My mother spent hours reading the Harry Potter books in the hope her son was still lingering somewhere in there. She had read them all to us as we were growing up. That sad, futile act of hope was more distressing to me than seeing what his shell had been reduced to. ETA. The exposed brain matter was some kind of plastic they placed over where they removed skull in an attempt to reduce the pressure on the brain. I'm guessing that when there was no improvement, they saw no reason to expend more effort or money sugarcoating the situation. Disturbing as in inexplicable, in probably 2010, early high school in rural eastern Minnesota, I was at a buddy's house with around 6 other friends. We were having a bonfire after a party, just chilling, drinking, a little, but nothing wild. Maybe it was 2 a.m. at this point. We decided to go stroll through the harvested farm fields, late September, and as we're out there being hooligans and whatnot, we saw an SUV, followed by a semi-truck, slowly drive down the adjacent county road. It was a 55-mile-per-hour speed limit road, and they were doing about 20 miles per hour. The semi's trailer had a side sliding door similar to a train car, with a mounted spotlight slowly sweeping the rolling farm fields. We all ducked to the ground out of sight, and the vehicles moved on. We all hopped up and nervously chuckled, kind of saying, "What the was that?" No more than 10 minutes later, we see a chopper, nighttime, so couldn't see type, in the distance with the mounted spotlight on the nose sweeping distant fields. We offhandedly joked, "It's coming right for us." And this thing did an effing 90-degree bank and beelined it at us. It took a second to register until that spotlight started cresting the hills, coming literally straight at us. They likely had thermal optics, and we all dipped. Being old-ass farmland, they had an old house foundation basement, slightly collapsed, but still accessible on their property. So about half of us hid in there from the chopper, and the other half ran all the way back to the house, and the chopper followed. After maybe 5 minutes, we peeked out of the collapsed basement, and this effing chopper was hovering maybe 150 feet over my buddy's house and didn't effing move for about 15 minutes. Eventually, it slowly flew off, and we didn't see anything else. Couple things of note. We called around 20 to 30 people from the party and asked them to check the news for any prison breaks or anything. There's a Supermax not very far away, but nothing came up. I've talked to cops, SF, fairly high career people, and 3-letter agencies. Nobody has any clue what it could have been, and I still want to know over a decade later. My mom had what I can only describe as a psychotic break while my 2 brothers and I were about 8 and 6. I have a twin. And she was convinced she had killed my grandfather with a propane torch. She had not. She had this robotic quality about her, like no emotion at all, glassy-eyed. I'll never forget it. Not something I would like to witness again, and thankfully she got help and hasn't happened since. When I was 7, I witnessed a teenager get hit by a train. It took him and his bike and disassembled them. We lived across from a train crossing. The trains would come around a corner that was obscured by huge blackberry thickets. For whatever reason, some of the cargo trains would blast through at ridiculous speeds, and it was a speeding train that killed the kid. They cut the blackberries back about once a year after that, and repainted the crossing guard bars, and made the alarm louder. It was really obnoxious, but after seeing that kid, I didn't complain. I also stopped running out to watch the trains. My wife is Filipino, married 20 years. She's been in the US for quite a while and hasn't been home. Lost her parents very young, and she became the matriarch. Her youngest brother killed himself by hanging. When she found out, abroad with me in the US, I was upstairs in my home, we own a ranch, and I heard a sound come out of her that I hope I never hear again. I've never heard sheer pain before. I hope I never hear a human make that sound again. My grandmother kneeling next to me at her son's casket, kissing it and saying, "That's my baby in there," and just crumbling into a ball. I was 6, but watching that has stuck with me vividly for years. She started begging to see him one last time, but it was a closed casket. He was found days after he died in a hot room, and my family didn't want her to see him like that. I just remember the look on her face. It was like the person she was left, and grief took its place. She's never been the same. That moment was the moment her life as she knew it has ended. My dad dying of cancer. He was in hospice. He reached the point of no response, but ever so slightly moved every now and then. His last position alive was lying in the bed with his eyes and mouth open. I remember coming down one night, walked through the living room to get to the kitchen. He looked exactly the same. I came down the next morning after my mom had awakened me to tell me he had passed. He looked exactly the same. There was just something so eerie about it. Dead silence. Never heard silence so loud before. Incredibly unnerving.